Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. And last week I said we'd do a little Q&A for this session. So let's go ahead and you ask your questions and I'll do my best to answer. So go ahead and unmute yourself or type in and fire away.
And you know what? I want to make sure I made it so you guys can, yeah, you guys can unmute yourself if you want. You can raise your hand for your questions as well. Are oils ever used in Astara prayers?
We don't make a practice of it, but it is something that could be done. Sure. Yeah. When I teach with the oil classes, I try to keep it about that. And, of course, the star is a big influence on the things that I teach there, amongst other things. But when we teach a star, I try to keep it as pure as I can. And it doesn't mean that those things can't overlap, but when I'm teaching them, I try to keep a star about a star. Yeah.
Thank you. And you should be able to unmute yourself. You're always welcome to type in as well. We had a question that came in last week and I did not copy it, so I'm going to try to do the gist of it. They were saying, I'm getting a surgery in a couple weeks, and I'm wondering, I had read that like I might need to do a soul retrieval after that. Is that true? What are your
Yeah, so the idea of soul retrieval, I mean, the name's a little bit misleading. Basically what happens with a traumatic event is, you could say it from a couple different versions of it. You could say that we end up having what you would call a trauma loop, where our our mind and our emotions have an experience, but then our body has a very different experience. And the different experiences, the nervous system just sees what it has to do to get through the situation. And once it kind of does that, the nervous system just kind of keeps doing it over and over again, right? So this becomes a loop. A lot of times when people say they get triggered, part of what happens is a loop gets engaged. You don't really choose it. It's like you're being pushed onto a roller coaster that you're going to ride, whether you like it or not, right? And so another way of saying that is that we go into what you would call automatic thinking or automatic behaving. And when you go through a traumatic event, surgery is, a choice, but it's still to the body as a trauma. It's good. It usually improves the quality of the body and everything, but still the body sees it as a trauma. And so there is a little bit of those mechanisms that can come into to play. And so the idea of soul retrieval, which is mostly a shamanic idea, people have adapted that idea or that principle. But basically, what you're doing is you're connecting with those pieces that have checked out, that are in that automatic behavior, automatic thinking. And they don't necessarily use the idea or the concept of trauma loops, but they refer to things as like fractures, which are like compressed pieces of the mind or the ego. And it just means that like the mind kind of shifts between these places and they're not necessarily connected. Another way of saying that is there's a disconnection between the body and the mind. And when that happens, we become very like intellectual in the things that we approach, whatever that might be. So the idea of soul retrieval is another way of like trying to address how we practice body awareness. We shift from intellect into the intuitive mind and we break out of those loops. And so the idea of dealing with any sort of trauma, including a surgery, it's good to do that before the surgery so that we don't go into the surgery all stressed out and upset and worried. You're calming the body down. The body's going into that procedure in a place of rest and repair and not stress and anxiety. And then once we come out of that, the body is able to go into a deeper level of repair mode. And so I would do the body awareness both before and after. And that is actually a much quicker way than doing the soul retrieval. But I mean, it depends. The soul retrieval depends on the practitioner. I've seen people do it and be somewhat effective. And then I've seen people do it and not super effective. So I would say it depends on the practitioner. And it probably depends on the version that they've been taught or that they do. But basically, you're doing the body awareness is more effective, it's quicker, and it's something that you can do on your own rather than having a practitioner do something like that. I don't have anything against the soul retrieval. I just, you know, it's easier just to do the body awareness. But if you do the soul retrieval, as long as the practitioner is good and knows what they're doing, I'm sure it will be, fine. That it's necessary, it depends. It depends on how traumatizing it was and how stressed out your body is afterwards. It might be necessary, it might not.
Thank you. And go ahead.
And good luck with your surgery. I hope everything goes well.
And go ahead, Linda.
Hey, Linda.
Hey, hi there. I was wondering if
Mhm.
you could give us some insight from the Astarian perspective, esoteric perspective on what is meant by God's will. What is God's will about?
So very interesting. If you look at like the idea of the spiritual energies, right? There's three kinds of spiritual energy. There's divine intelligence, which is the light aspect, and in the body, it's the manifestation of the nervous system where we're in fight, flight, or rest and repair mode. Like basically, that directly corresponds to an aspect of the tree of life. And so, even if you look at like each of the chakras, each of the energy centers, and we look at the heart has like spiritual qualities, it has psychological qualities, it has physical qualities, and there's also an aspect of God within it. But then there's also an adversary there. Like, part of our development is overcoming or vanquishing, or a better way of saying is mastering those negative tendencies and cultivating the positive. And if you look at what that means, is the deeper the level of like vagal tone, like improved neurological function on the rest and repair side, and the more that we regulate the sympathetic nervous system, which is our action, activity, but also fight, flight, that is the development of the aspect of God within each of the centers. The more that we're in a super stress state or an unregulated sympathetic nervous system state, the more that we are in repetition and intellect in a very rigid state of like homeostasis, and the body's being driven by the lower nature, which is then more of the lower tendencies within each of the chakras. the more that we regulate that and cultivate deeper levels of veil tone, we start to cultivate the aspect of God. We start to cultivate the positive quality or the positive tendency within each of the chakra. And we begin to manifest the positive psychological expressions from the chakra versus the negative ones, right? And so when this is put in play, you're basically harnessing divine intelligence or you're harnessing divine light. And for us to be able to experience love, divine love, not necessarily human love, but divine love, we have to harness light. If we don't harness light, our ability to perceive and experience love is very, very diminished. Like it's there, but it's not something that's like a driving force in our life. And so as we balance and harness the nervous system, then this quality of divine love kind of comes into play. And divine love is more of a providence or a stabilizing factor. It's what helps us to be good as a person, but it also helps to bring goodness in our life. Right. And then when that kind of stability is in place, that kind of providence, then the following aspect is you could call it divine will, divine power. Um, it's basically creative destruction. And so this is the purification of something to make it more spiritualized. You know, in a person, we experience a little bit of divine will or divine power and the manifestation of creative destruction so that we maybe eradicate patterns in our life, karmic issues, negative tendencies, so that we have greater levels of soul contact or perceptions that would come from the soul. In the outer world, divine power, divine will, or God's will, right? It can manifest where something is going through a change, you know, some form of creative destruction where something's breaking down, so something new arises that's more appropriate. Now, the difficulty with that is that as humans, with the things that happen in the outer world, you know, in everyday society and things, that God's will or divine power, it works on a very different timeline than what we would think. You know, a lot of times we would see it in a moment or over a week, over a month, or even a year, when really it might be a cycle that is in motion that's going to happen over a few hundred years, you know, sometimes even longer. And so we don't always see it for what it is, but it's usually breaking down something to make room for more light or more soul contact, or in a case of society, that the society starts to be driven and there's some sort of goodness that everybody's pursuing. So, um, you know, through the ages, it's been a manifestation of different things, and usually it's facilitated by spiritual teachers or disciples. You know, spiritual teachers and disciples aren't always somebody coming to teach us how to say Om and to pray and meditate. Sometimes they're in science, sometimes they're in economics, sometimes they're in different disciplines to help move humanity in a direction that is, you know, beneficial. And so the manifestation of God's will is some form of creative destruction, you know, like a breaking down of a tendency, a pattern, a way of thinking, a perception. Um, you know, this is the way I've always done it, and now it's done. You know, sometimes that's just negative things happening, but sometimes it's creative destruction, and it might it might look bad before it looks good sometimes, to the human eye. Externally, internally, we usually have some sort of realization or something, but the time frame internally is very different than the time frame externally.
Mm.
And so harder to perceive in the outside world, easier to perceive because even, like when you're having meditation and you're reflecting on something and you have this realization of something and you kind of tear up a little bit. That is also God's will or divine power. It's a breaking down of an old perception so that now you have this new perception.
Mm.
And in that, something got sacrificed, something died off, something fell away, right? And so, um, even though it's pleasant and it's like something that you like, there's part of us, usually a little bit more of our lower nature or like a bit of a attachment to the repetition of it all that we grieve some of that. It's very normal. And so if you think about the idea of like in the Christian tradition, being born again is this kind of God's will or creative destruction. We're letting go of an old viewpoint or an old personality or way of doing things so that we can move closer to our true essence or closer to God. In Buddhism, they would say, I die many times. Like in a lifetime, I might die many, many times. Like if you look in the Native American tradition, when they go into a sweat lodge, they go in and they say, they say it in, I traveled with somebody that was Lakota. So he said it in Lakota, but they would say, today is a good day to die. And if you look at it at first, you think like, oh, I might physically die here, but it's not a physical death. It's a letting go of something that's not aligned with God within me. Like I'm today's a good day to let that go and let that die off. And so it's a cultivation in that ceremony to align with greater levels of truth and greater levels of our true nature. And so even there, it's a purification, which is another way of saying creative destruction or divine power. Or God's will, I think is the term you used. Different ways of saying the same thing, but they're all kind of the same thing.
I love that though as a way to sort of reframe the words God's will as creative destruction and that idea that, whatever's happening is happening for us, not to us.
Right.
Right? And
It,
and so I love the way you've just framed that. That's very nice.
and if you think about like even the idea of light, like the light or essence interacting with the form, um, that is when the light comes in and starts interacting with a form, that is divine order. Like because even as the light comes in, it's not just light. There's like different aspects of the light. And with Astara in the second degree lesson, there's the aspect of four aspects of the blood, right? These four aspects of the blood are a more physicalized manifestation of light. And so when you say the holy name in like in the Jewish tradition, it's Yod He Vahe, like a easier way to say it is Jehovah. But
Mhm.
when you say that, it's those four aspects of the divine plan in manifest in
Mm.
coming into manifestation. And so when you say those names or those words, it is a concretizing or a physicalization of light into the form. And so at first we're starting to establish order and then providence, and then eventually, it is making space for something new. And each aspect is tied to the evolutionary process we have as souls being in a body. And so, like when one of the disciples goes to Christ when you know, the next day he's going to get nailed to the cross. And you know, he says something like, "We're with you, teacher," and he goes, "By the time the crow or the rooster crows 3 times, or yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, you'll deny me 3 times." And
Mm.
it's the refusal of divine light, divine love, and divine power. And so, you know, like in different alchemical practices, you know, the idea of evil isn't like a devil and a pitchfork and everybody, you know, being red and walking around with pitchforks and everything. It's just the refusal of those 3 parts: refusal of light, refusal of love, and refusal of power. And if you look at most spiritual traditions, they're love oriented. You know, love your neighbor, love yourself, be devotional to the deity, you know, love, 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 love. And which is good because that is like the path for the general public that is an easier one to follow. But at some point, aligning yourself with the light deepens that process of experiencing divine love. And in that love component, you know, it's kind of, I don't know. Over the years, I've thought about creative destruction in a different way because when you think about it from like where you're at in the moment, you're like, something's going to be torn from my hands, and like I'm going to have to make these big shifts to let go of these things in my life and the way I think and everything. But when you're in that deeper space of love, it's more like they just fall away. It's not like it's this, you know, coming in and just ripping things out of your hand and just like your life is going to change. It's almost like, yeah, I'm ready for my life to change. I'm ready to let this go. It becomes more like a hug from an old friend than somebody coming in and taking a bunch of your stuff, you know. But from the point of view of not being in alignment with light and having begin to like really deeply experience and cultivate the love aspect, that's what it feels like, you know. And so from the intellectual mind, there's resistance to that idea, but from the place of love, it's just the next thing that happens. Like it's just like, well, of course I'm going to let these things go. Like why would I hold on to them? You know, it's from my conditioning or it's something that I was taught from when I was young and I identified with it. Some I came in with, whatever it might be. Of course I'm going to let this go. It doesn't serve me anymore. And so it's this really kind of gentle thing. I mean, sometimes it can be a little bit more intense, but even then, there's a lot more acceptance, and you can kind of see like this is for a greater good next year or something. Like you kind of have an idea of it. But when we're not ready, it feels like having spiritual diarrhea. You know what I mean? It's like it's uncomfortable, a lot's happening, you know, too much is coming out, too much shifting, too much change. You know, it's depleting, it makes you feel tired. You know, it can be a little much. Yeah,
Mhm. Thank you. That was really, really helpful and wonderful. Thank you so much.
you're so welcome.
And go ahead, Marie.
Hey, Marie.
Hi, I have a question. I wrote a few things, it comes to my mind in this chat that I needed to emphasize with you about. I have a picture, I don't know if I pronounced it correct, they ascended the master, which is relate to Ashtara. He is the master, the Katamuni, how do you pronounce?
Kutumi.
Yeah,
Kutumi.
I have
Yeah.
him here in my left. I call my space a lab
Uh-huh.
because in this lab, all what I do is the meditation, all my sacred things, and I have him in my left side, lay in. I'm surrounded by crystals, real
Mhm.
crystals, not a stone, is vases all that thing. He is rest on in a piece of really. Let me show you so you have an idea. He's rest on this piece, Salayonite, it calls.
Okay. Yeah.
He rests on this, and what I see on him when I meditation, even listen to you, I wonder if you can confirm this, if everybody be able to see this. He changed expressions to me, and I see light like you're talking about, or we are surrounded by the white light.
Mhm.
And I see some the color of the star around his forehead, around the cheek, around here, kind of yellow surround his hair,
Mhm.
and his face expression is serenity.
Yeah.
Do you see him like
So
that?
the thing that I would say is, as we go through and we do our practices, um, we're going to have to jump over. We'll start talking about, but we might have to move over to the next stream in just a minute or two. But what I would say is that part of what's happening is as you're looking at an image and you're looking at the form, and the form eventually turns into beginning to like we have a deeper level of experience with the essence of that being or that teacher. And so as that starts to happen, you'll start to have inner perceptions of the teacher, and it's you could say it's like more alive. When we're looking at the drawing's there, but like when we start having our inner experiences, it's almost like you're seeing the teacher in front of you, and that becomes more alive or more spirited.
Like he's talking to me in a silent way, and I
Yeah,
offer
yeah.
him the magenta flower. This is I got today. It's by him.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Anytime you radiate love to a teacher like that, usually deepens the connection.
Yeah, I feel he is the master of my heart to guide
Yeah.
me. After I strive in the real life, take care of my responsibility. When I enter
Good.
my lab, the first expression I see is him because he was here with us, right?
Mhm.
He was among us in the body,
Yes, he was. Yeah, yeah.
and that's what I understood. So I surround him through this. Look, this is surround him. This vase here is a pure crystal, and I get
Right.
into vases with all sorts of sophisticated crystal surround him since I got his picture from Astara.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. We are going to have to move over to the other stream, so follow us over, and if
Okay,
you have more that you
okay.
want to share, you can share it
Thank
just a
you. Thank
minute.
you so much for your teachings.
You're
I
so welcome.
appreciate.